When you start Donkey Kong 64, this is the first track. Well, no, okay, this is the first track you hear, but after you pick a save file, this is the first music you listen to. Now, I'm no musical expert, but this piece brings out so many different emotions in such a short period of time. It starts off very peaceful and almost therapeutic, as if there's no worries whatsoever on DK Isles. But the music starts to ramp up and becomes a little bit more exciting and almost victorious, as if the battle has already been won. You'd almost expect this part of the song to appear as a staff roll rather than the introduction. But things start to change as the music gets lower and becomes more daunting as the looming threat of King K. Rool's ship enters the scene. It makes it feel like an authority is entering your home to change your life forever. That authority being the king himself, who patiently sits at his throne room, tapping his fingers, waiting for his opportunity to disrupt peace more than ever before. But despite his confidence, his staff seems rather unqualified, and soon we're greeted with noises of alarms and general machinery breaking down, causing the ship to rock back and forth before eventually crashing into the DK Isles itself. By now, the music somehow toes the line between slapstick and scary in a very seamless fashion. This all results in a stare down between the DK Isles and K. Rool's cruiser, almost as if they're in a quick draw, just waiting for someone to pull out their weapon. The music finishes in an intense fashion, letting you know your adventure is about to be massive. The reason I'm bringing this all up is because Donkey Kong 64, like many other rare games, can make you feel so much emotion in such a short period of time. That introduction is a sample as to why I felt so attached to the game growing up. The promise of adventure, the mysteries to be uncovered, and the resolution of bringing DK Isles back to the victorious state we found it in. Simply put, I ate this up as a kid, and it was easily my favorite game. What I didn't know is that it would have such an impact on me in the future in terms of my critical analysis towards games. Because revisiting a game I cherished as much as Donkey Kong 64 in the modern light really showed me, hey, not everything holds up as much as my childhood self would like it to. And it turns out, I'm not the only one. As the years would go on, Donkey Kong 64's reputation would only get worse and worse until now it's sometimes credited as being the game that killed what we love about the 3D platforming genre. Now, to be clear, there were still 3D platformers after 1999, and we still find 3D platformers today. But what people mean by that sentiment is that late 90s 3D platformers are not like the platformers you see today. I recently talked about how 3D platforming was born out of necessity. It was the primary way to show people how to navigate the 3D world in the video gaming landscape. But in the early 2000s, there were all these games like Ratchet & Clank, Jak 2 and 3, Sly Cooper, all these games that would sometimes be labeled as 3D platformers, but to be honest, the 3D platforming aspect of it was secondary. Their spectacle was now more narrative or action. 3D platforming itself became a core mechanic. It was no longer a spectacle. But going back to late 90s 3D platformers, a lot of people credit Donkey Kong 64 as leading the genre to its death. And after all, it did sell over 5 million copies, and its reception would only degrade as time continued. It's an easy scapegoat, but I think the blame mostly goes towards the oversaturation of the genre in general. This is a list of all of the 3D platformers released in the late 90s, and as you could see, the genre was just waiting to burst. It's no wonder gamers were feeling fatigued, especially when those 3D platformers decided to go above and beyond, adding more content into their game than ever before. The genre wasn't just bloated by how many games there were, but also bloated in the content of the game itself. Donkey Kong 64 was both the loudest and the most bloated of all. There were just too many needles in this 3D platforming bubble, and it eventually popped. And to this day, we rarely see games try to replicate that late 90s 3D platforming style. But that brings us to the most important question. Is Donkey Kong 64 actually that bad? Yes. It's pretty bad. It's not great. It's both not great and bad. Not a good combination. And the sad part is there are a lot of practical fixes that could have been made to make this game truly one of the great 3D platformers of the late 90s. But before we get into fixing anything, let's talk about what actually was great with this game. As I hope I've conveyed through describing the introduction of Donkey Kong 64, Rare has an impeccable ability of adding charm to every aspect of each of their games. And I'm not just talking about their 3D platformers, even their current game, Sea of Thieves, Thieves is littered with charm, as well as their Super Nintendo endeavors such as Donkey Kong Country 1 through 3. Whether it's through an amazing soundtrack, beautiful scenery, or sound effects that go way harder than they should, you always feel connected with a Rare game, and that's not something every studio has been able to accomplish. It's really hard to not feel connected to Donkey Kong 64. When you're exploring its large-scale worlds with varying colors and music that changes depending on the different caverns that you decide to enter, complemented by the various environmental effects such as bats flying across the screen or distant sounds of water dropping and echoing across the rooms. It all incentivizes you to explore more and collect more and uncover mysteries that need to be uncovered. One of my favorite worlds in terms of atmosphere is Frantic Factory. On paper, a toy factory sounds fun, a place where joy is literally invented in front of you. But here it's depicted as some grungy, dangerous warehouse factory. In each of the major rooms, there is a diagram that shows you which department you're currently in, and depending on which department you're in, the aesthetic can greatly change, with music getting higher tempo or lower tempo, with bigger thuds in the background or a little bit more calm. This world also happens to have the best boss in the game, that being Jack-in-the-Box. It's equally scary as it is charming and thematically accurate to the world that it's in. It also helps that it's quite difficult, making it a very rewarding boss to defeat. This thing scared me half to death when I was a kid, and it really aids that dangerous, daunting tone that's been underlining the whole game up to this point. That tone might waver a little bit around the end, but we'll definitely get into that. But it all conveys the sense of watching how a sausage gets made, and you want nothing to do with toys after going here. This is just one of several unique worlds that invokes its own emotions and carries its own aesthetic, yet somehow each of the worlds in Donkey Kong 64 feel almost grounded with each other. Like if you walked far enough in Jungle Japes, you might stumble across Gloomy Galleon or Creepy Castle or even Angry Aztec. The world design, and I don't necessarily mean level design with that, as I'm specifically talking about non-gameplay elements, but the world design is great. But there are some positive things to say about the gameplay. Donkey Kong 64 is a Metroidvania 3D platform, which I understand might sound crazy hearing out loud, but it is the truth. Progression feels equally tied to explorative platforming, as well as items being used for unlocking doors as well as unlocking abilities. Now, this isn't holistically unique to Donkey Kong 64, as a lot of people could make the same argument for Banjo-Kazooie. But I think Donkey Kong 64's hyperfixation on progression is what makes it stand out amongst Banjo-Kazooie and other collectathons of the era. Probably the most interesting thing about Donkey Kong 64 as a 3D platformer is that you can play as 5 different characters. Each of these characters have their own unique abilities and strengths and weaknesses that incentivizes you to play one Kong over another at any given time. But I'll be the first to say this wasn't executed 100% perfectly. We'll get into it. But lastly, I'd like to mention that in a nutshell, the mass amount of content that's in Donkey Kong 64 is a good thing, but I feel like I gotta delicately broach this subject. I'm not sure I 100% agree with any sentiment that says a game should take a certain amount of time to beat. There's definitely some truth in that criticism, but by principle, I think if the content itself is fun and enjoyable, then it shouldn't matter if there is a lot of it before you reach the end credits. Now, there are a lot of things that aren't fun that you have to do in order to beat Donkey Kong 64, and the criticisms I feel should stay focused on those areas of boredom, not necessarily the length of the game or the amount of content that's presented. Which is why I say the amount of things you do in Donkey Kong 64 is actually a good thing and admirable. The things you do themselves is where the problems lie. And that seems like a good point as any to start talking about everything that's wrong with Donkey Kong 64. I hope you have your snacks, because this is going to take a while. Let's talk about a gaming buzzword known as backtracking. Because when you hear this, sometimes you want to cower. You want to grab your blanket, hide under the table until the weather clears. But I don't think it's because backtracking is inherently bad. I think it's forced backtracking that really becomes an issue. When you return to an area that's already been explored to collect something you couldn't previously, you feel a shot of adrenaline, you feel gratification, you feel like you've earned that reward for your due diligence. But when you're required to retrace your steps to get a collectible that you need to collect to beat the game, you just feel like your time is wasted, and it's not due diligence making you come back here. The game is forcing your hand. The problem with Donkey Kong 64 is that the majority of collectibles require you to backtrack in order to collect them. And just to re-emphasize that point, the majority of collectibles, of which there are thousands, you are required to backtrack in order to collect. Now, the backtracking itself can be big or small depending on one very big factor, that being how close is the nearest tag barrel. Oh yeah, we're in it now. We're talking about the infamous tag barrel. Other than fairies and battle crowns and other minor collectibles, every collectible needs to be collected by a specific Kong, and you cannot switch Kongs whenever you want. You need to go back to one of these godforsaken tag barrels. A large percentage of your playtime in Donkey Kong 64 is going down long lines of collectibles that you actually can't pick up because you just happened to choose the Kong of your choosing like an hour ago. Okay, not an hour ago, that's awfully hyperbolic, but it feels that way sometimes. All that to say, so much playtime is allocated just to walking back towards the nearest tag barrel, and that is indeed backtracking. The most heinous part is that bananas seem to almost exclusively line up to areas that does not require the same Kong as it required to pick up those bananas in the first place. Like, it's straight up trolling you. You'll have a blueprint that's a different color from the banana balloon in the sky, that's a different color from the coins in the corner, and a different color from the line of bananas that took you there in the first place. And that's not even factoring in golden bananas, the main collectibles of the game, and how they require a specific Kong in order to complete the challenge before collecting them. So even when all of the minor collectibles require a specific Kong, you might get to the challenge which requires a completely different Kong, and I'm just like, why? Why put this here? Why not put it over here? Or over there? You're wasting my time. Are you trying to waste my time? My time feels wasted. This may feel like a cheap shot because it's the first thing people point to when they negatively critique Donkey Kong 64, but it's also one of the most egregious things that could have been fixed relatively easily. We'll get more into the fixes later, but one of the biggest band-aids that has already been established to work well for fixing some of the rough edges of this game is to allow players to switch Kongs whenever they want. I must confess, most of the footage you see in this video is actually from a modded version of the game that has a mod called Tag Anywhere. It lets you tag anywhere, you know, switch Kongs. It's kind of self-explanatory. Not having to backtrack to a tag barrel makes this game insurmountably better. I can't describe how much of a more positive experience I had with the game as soon as that mod was in place. But I'm getting off track. In fact, I might need to backtrack to get to the topic at hand, which of course is backtrack. I think it's somewhat inevitable to have backtracking in a game with worlds as large as they are in Donkey Kong 64. What's not inevitable are the very long hallways that disconnect portions of the world from each other. I'm sure performance is part of the reason as to why this happened, but the unified feeling of world design does not translate into the actual level design, where various parts of the world are fragmented with long spaces in between them. When you remember the fun parts of Donkey Kong 64, you're probably not thinking about the obnoxiously long tunnels in Angry Aztec, or the confusing ups and downs of Frantic Factory, or the mass amounts of unnecessary swimming in Gloomy Galleon. Apparently, it just wasn't enough to bloat the game in terms of collectibles, but also with mass amounts of rooms and doors that have locks and keys, and it's all a big headache at some point. Now, the game does have warp pads in each of the levels, which essentially acts as fast travel, but it's a little bit strenuous to try to remember exactly where the 2 pads are, or where the 4 pads are, or where the 5 pads are, because when there are 10 pads total in a world, in each of the worlds, you just start to get them a little bit confused. But even for someone who's played the game as much as I have, I'm still making plenty of mistakes and going up and down the wrong pads, and I'm tired of it. Can I be tired? Is that allowed? Will you allow me to be tired? But it's still a W I'll take, because I'd rather navigate through that than constantly walking down long hallways that tend to look the same as each other. Something the Metroid Prime games was always praised for was making each hallway feel distinct from each other. There was always some orientation of the room or fascinating wall decal that really separated the hallways from each other. Meanwhile, I'll still get lost in the halls of Frantic Factory because they all look the same, and it ends up feeling like a labyrinth when it really shouldn't feel like one. I also want to quickly talk about a big part of this game, that being the puzzles, and I put them in quotes for a reason. A large majority of Donkey Kong 64's puzzles are to the point of brain-deadery, as you could say. You are almost always just matching Kong colors to Kongs, or Kong faces to Kongs, or Kong letters to the Kong word. So much Kong matching in these puzzles. A small handful of these would be fine and albeit charming, but by the time you get to Fungi Forest, you already know that yellow is Donkey Kong, blue is Lanky Kong, green is Chunky Kong. We don't need to be tested on this every single world. I understand that not every fan of the 3D platforming genre wants to have strenuous puzzles. Sometimes the brain-dead stuff is easier for them to progress. But at what point do you ask yourself, hey, if all these puzzles use the same solution, maybe I don't need them in the first place? I think there are already plenty of challenges in Donkey Kong 64 from both good and bad sources, to the point where you could completely remove the puzzles from the game, and I don't think much would be missing. So in my head, either make them well-crafted puzzles or just nix them completely, because honestly, it's not something that's 100% required of a 3D platformer. I talked a little bit about how many locks there are, and a big reason there are so many locks is because they needed to give value to the collectibles that you collect. It's a case of the collectibles needing to be justified, as opposed to justifying collectibles in a pre-existing world. That really shows the backwards mentality of the design of this game. It went in with the approach of, how can we have this many collectibles and give reason to get all of them, instead of, here is the world, what collectibles make sense to make this engaging. And in their efforts to give collectibles worth, you end up having things like character abilities and upgrades being specifically used to open up doors and nothing else. Yes, the guns can be used to shoot enemies, but let's be honest, their primary purpose is to unlock a door with a certain Kong, because God forbid you choose any Kong to open up a door. The instruments are kind of helpful because you get to kill all the enemies in the room, but in a weird way that makes the guns themselves less valuable, making them more as just keys to doors. Diddy Kong has an ability where he can ram his head into an object, but all it's really used for is unlocking something. Donkey Kong has an ability where he can spit in his hands, rub them together, and pull any lever he wants. All that does is unlock things. Tiny Kong has an ability that allows her to use a warp pad that no other Kong can use, thus the same as just unlocking a door. Chunky Kong has an ability that literally unlocks objects in the room that weren't previously there. All of these examples are just keys to unlock things, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but if there's no creative application for the ability itself, then why should we feel excited about unlocking it? All this does is give each type of lock its own cutscene, but by the time you're at the end of the game, you're sick of all the cutscenes anyway. You'll really want to skip the 40th time you pull the lever to play the Donkey Kong arcade cabinet. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. Now, there were some upgrades that directly affected the mobility of platforming itself, and those were definitely the best ones to be integrated. Tiny Kong's ability to allow her to fly through the air with ponytails is great and one of my favorites in the entire game. Lanky Kong can find barrels that allows him to go really fast, but it's a little bit tricky to actually navigate when going that fast, something that is directly affecting the player experience while also being flashy and unique towards the character itself. I want to give a half shout out to Diddy Kong's jetpack, which really should be a great way to have an unlockable that directly affects the platforming in a platformer, but it also just controls awfully, and every challenge that involves it is one I'd rather skip. But other than the few examples of mobility enhancing upgrades, most of them are just keys to open up doors for the sake of progressing through the game. That is where the Metroidvania genre clashes with the 3D platforming genre. It doesn't have to clash, but 3D platforming has to work in unison with the progression elements that are added by a Metroidvania. This is something we've seen done very well in 2D platforming Metroidvanias, such as Hollow Knight. Several of the upgrades you get in Hollow Knight directly affect your mobility through the game, ensuring that neither style interrupts each other in the flow of the game. But we just rarely see a 3D platformer actually accomplish this. Again, Banjo's close, but still a different scale. Now, despite Donkey Kong 64 trying to justify the value of its collectibles, there are still a lot of them that you don't need to get, in fact have no reason to get, and it becomes very upsetting when you do get them. You only need a specific amount of colored bananas in order to unlock the boss of each world, and after the boss is unlocked, you can still collect more to get the banana medals. Now granted, you do need 15 banana medals in order to beat the game, but after the banana medal is collected, there's no longer value to the colored bananas in each world. So out of the total 3,500 colored bananas, there are 875 that have absolutely no reason to be collected. They're not even factored into the 101% completion rating. There's literally no reason to get that many bananas in this game. And that's just the colored bananas. The colored coins, I'm not even getting into them. I'm not even getting into the fact that you have way more than you'll ever need. Why on earth would they add that many? Doesn't matter, I'm not getting into it. For some reason, instead of making bananas either a replenishable collectible or having less bar of entry for the amount of bananas needed to progress in the game, they decided let's just make a ton of extra collectibles that you don't need whatsoever because it'll help smooth things over for when they do progress. As someone who enjoys collecting in a collectathon, I get kind of pissed off when I see non-replenishable collectibles that I want to collect even though I know there's no reason whatsoever to actually pick them up. I still usually pick them up because it's in my blood. I'm the demographic for this collectathon stuff, so if I'm complaining, you know you did something wrong. I remember Breath of the Wild getting some flack for the Korok seeds. Donkey Kong 64 did it way worse. The last thing I want to mention about the collectibles is the blueprints, which in theory, I actually like the mechanic of the blueprints. I know I might be alone in that. They are a considerably rare item as there's only 5 of them per world, and I think the main issue is that people don't fully understand what they do when they collect them. Like, they don't know why blueprints are important until they get to the very end of the game, and by then they already have enough blueprints to pretty easily go through Hideout Helm anyway. Also, this is a bit of a side tangent, but Hideout Helm is actually a really good level. I have no idea what the reception is to having a time limit that's based off of how many blueprints you collect, but I kind of think it's great, and I love the Kong individual challenges that's presented there. Also, the music goes hard. Anyways, to screw with your brain even more, the blueprints can be sold to Snide in exchange for a golden banana, making a lot of players, I think, just assume that that is their purpose, is a collectible that's swapped out for a golden banana, making no tangible difference. But I think there's some easy fixes for that one, and we'll definitely get into that later. I know, we're getting into everything apparently. Has anyone looked at the time? Another issue that's both big and small is the final boss. Don't get me wrong, the final boss is a lot of fun. But what's also been fun is the lingering feeling of eeriness and daunting trouble, incoming dangers that are about to be imposed on the Donkey Kong Island. And every time you see K. Rool's face plastered on a door or a platform, even though it's a very kooky face, it's still just kind of scary because it's just reminding you Daddy K. Rool is always watching. It always reminds you that King K. Rool is always watching. I can't just pretend it didn't happen, it happened. But my buddy Seth brought up something that I only now really realize what he's talking about. The tonality shift of the final boss feels comical to the point where it doesn't match the rest of the tone of the game. And I think that's why it's off-putting, especially for the climax of your entire journey. As a kid, I was always looking forward to the day where I storm his throne room and find K. Rool in the flesh just to hear his maniacal voice boom at me in person. And yet, instead, he just runs and gets on a flying plane, and inside of the plane that crashes, there's a boxing ring. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Don't get me wrong, it's funny, and I think you could definitely get away with that tomfoolery for any other boss that's not the finale. If you play that introduction scene right next to the cutscenes of the final boss, it just feels like they're from 2 different movies. But at the very least, I do think the K. Rool boss fight is very fun as it utilizes the Kong's abilities extremely well, which could be the reason it originated from a boxing ring, not from a place that makes way more sense for the narrative. I'm not entirely sure why, but this game's platforming feels a lot worse than Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, Banjo-Kazooie, and Spyro. It could be the level design has brought in far too precise platforming sections for something that should be more broad and forgiving, or it could be that the worlds had become too complex for what a 90s 3D camera could handle. But whether it be jumping onto crates floating in lava, backflipping up to monkey tongues, and trying to just not fall in the crack between the conveyor belts and the wall, I mean, come on, why are these not connected? To even just walking in a straight line so you don't fall off the bridge is something that doesn't feel natural. Donkey Kong 64 just has so much confidence that its players will be able to navigate its platforming challenges despite the game itself actually running poorly and having rough frame rate that very much affects your platforming experience. I understand that performance is a bit of a low blow for a game made in the late 90s, but it's honestly such an issue here, more so than it has been in Banjo-Kazooie and any of the other 3D platformers that had the same limitations as Donkey Kong. Someone more experienced than myself could probably bring more nuance into why the platforming feels as bad as it does. All I know is that it feels noticeably worse than the likes of platformers before and after. Now I want to rapid fire some of my nitpicks or just minor inconveniences with the game. The first one being bonus barrels. These things suck. They don't have to, but they do. They're charming at first, but after you do 4 or 5 of them, they start to repeat and become more of an annoyance rather than something you're excited to jump into, especially when you already did a challenge just to unlock a secondary challenge in the form of a banana barrel. Another annoyance is that shooting straight up feels bad, and I just wish it didn't. I feel like pulling out a weapon that's so distinct to the Kong that holds it should be exciting, rather than a chore that's used exclusively to open up doors or shoot pesky bees that are impossible to shoot in the first place. And I'm not even getting started with the banana balloons. Why do so many items have ammo attached to them? It becomes visually cumbersome to always see collectibles that mean almost nothing to you because you very rarely run out of ammo. We call that a pumpkin down the garbage disposal. And lastly, this isn't even a minor inconvenience, this is a major one. In order to win the game, you need to beat the Donkey Kong arcade game twice. And they go even further by requiring you to also get a high score in the Jetpack arcade game made by Rare. These are completely unnecessary additions that could have been cool Easter eggs, but ridiculous requirements for making the finish line. I believe that encompasses just about everything wrong with Donkey Kong 64. But now I want to talk about a grocery list of fixes that are all pretty practical and could have changed the trajectory of reception that Donkey Kong 64 got in a different reality. With a handful of band-aids, some big and some small, this really could have been one of the platforming greats. We touched on this earlier, but being able to switch Kongs would help the game dramatically. In fact, you could go even as far as removing Kong-specific collectibles in addition to being able to change Kongs. I know on paper it sounds interesting to have blueprints, coins, and bananas and golden bananas that all correlate to which character you're playing as, but instead of having the collectible itself be restricted by who you are, just put more emphasis on the individual challenges that aid themselves towards which Kong you pick. That way the player actually feels gratification for deciding which Kong is best in a given situation, as opposed to a button on top of a door telling you, hey, this is the Kong you need to play. The player would actually have to do some puzzle solving. And while we're on the topic of Kongs, the most interesting part of this 3D platformer, we want to make sure each of their abilities aren't just keys to unlock things. We want to make sure that they directly affect the platforming experience of this 3D platformer. And these upgrades really shouldn't be location specific. If they are fun enough and allow you to be creative with platforming, then you shouldn't limit the player as to when they can use their new favorite ability. As for collectibles, we really just need to cut down the ones that aren't absolutely essential. I'm looking at you, Battle Crowns, and banana medals, and fairies. The list goes on, actually. Colored bananas should really only go up to the 75 per Kong mark for the sake of the banana medals. There's no reason to have extra if they don't give you anything in return. Or at the very least, let extra bananas carry over to the next world so players don't feel like they wasted their time for getting that extra nanners. I think the number of blueprints per world is fine, but I think they'd be a lot more gratifying to collect if the Kersplats themselves didn't respawn, so after you kill them once, they're gone forever. It would also be cool if players could enter Hideout Helm before they have nearly enough time or abilities to actually complete it. That way they can see real time, their timer going up every time a blueprint is collected. The big problem with coins is that you'll generally have more than you ever need, and they're directly tied to progression, not optional things to buy. So you can either cut coins completely and just have everything being bought to buy colored bananas since you're already getting them anyway, or you can make them replenishable and let players use them to buy ammunition for their various abilities. This would also cut down on the many replenishable collectibles that are laid across the world that really don't need to be there other than to make the player feel like, hey, I should go collect those even though I'm never out of oranges, I'm never out of ammo, and only sometimes out of music. Honestly, it really doesn't make sense to have music use ammunition anyway. Instead, you could put it on a cooldown and prevent players from overusing it that way. On the topic of ammunition, there is some ways to make guns a little bit more valuable than just opening up doors. One of the harder ways to do that is to make shooting actually feel good, although they were technically limited with how much first-person shooter experience the industry has had. But beyond that tall ask, you could also give each gun different stats, allowing the player to choose which gun to use in a given situation. As for the world design, let's just remove every hallway. I'm being facetious. You don't have to remove every hallway. In fact, part of Hideout Helm's massive charm is its isolated tunneling feel, but generally the bigger worlds shouldn't have such long stretches between the large areas of interest, even if that comes at the cost of more loading zones. Gloomy Galleon is screwed. You can't fix it, just remove it from the game. Cut your losses, say goodbye. Again, facetious, but oh my gosh, does this level have so many issues. Some realistic fixes you could do is to just make the water not so deep, let you get to the ocean floor a lot quicker than usual, and don't lock the swordfish behind Lanky Kong, alright? Let anyone use it. It's super helpful to navigate, just Just let us get through the level peacefully. There's also so many doors. For a world as big as Gloomy Galleon, you'd expect them to fill up the corners with the activities that are inside the doors, but no, they're all locked behind specific Kong switches, and it just becomes a nightmare, and a lot of them just lead to banana barrels. And I hate banana barrels, but if you have to keep them in the game, maybe don't let them repeat the same minigames over and over. And I don't like how bonus barrels are often a challenge on top of another challenge. Like, have bonus barrels be for the freebies, not necessarily extra hard work for the same value of collectible. And last but not least, don't make us beat Donkey Kong twice and get a high score in Jetpack. Let those things be really cool Easter eggs and nothing more. I think most of these fixes would have been very doable and would have had a huge impact on how we actually perceive Donkey Kong 64 as the decades go on. But alas, that's not the reality we live in, and now we only see Donkey Kong 64 as a pile of rubbish with too much stank going on to even see the glistening treasure that was at the heart of it. But recently, Nintendo announced something that I didn't think I would see anytime soon, which was a new 3D Donkey Kong game, that being Donkey Kong Bananza. For years, I've been telling myself that a new 3D Donkey Kong game is something that I desperately want. The truth is, what I've really wanted is another attempt at Donkey Kong 64. Sadly, it doesn't look like that's what Bananza is going to be. Don't get me wrong, nothing about the trailers that I've seen make Donkey Kong Bananza look bad, but I guess its existence really confirms that we are never returning to the forgotten style of Donkey Kong 64, regardless of the potential it had. A true Metroidvania 3D platformer with multi-characters to choose from, and large-scale worlds backed up with an equal amount of charm, and perhaps just a throwback to the glory days of Rare. All stuff that unfortunately feels more like a pipe dream now that Super Mario Odyssey 2, aka Donkey Kong Bananza, is just on the horizon. The world may have forgotten about Donkey Kong 64, but I have not, and neither have its various modders and other community members. If you've never played Donkey Kong 64 before, I recommend playing it with the Tag Anywhere mod, as it makes the experience far more positive. And if you have played before and just want to find a way to make it fun again, then I definitely recommend checking out the DK64 randomizer. Somehow, randomizing the value of collectibles really eases the pain of collectibles being confusing in the first place. And it also has a lot of quality of life additions, one of which allows you to tag anywhere. Both my buddy Seth and I have been sinking hours into this, and it's honestly been the most fun I've had with Donkey Kong 64 in a very long time. And even if you don't find enjoyment in that, I hope that at the very least you can think back to moments like the initial introduction, that which was filled with so much hope and intrigue and mystery, to at least pay respects towards what could have been with Donkey Kong 64. If you'd like to hear more about my personal experience with Donkey Kong 64, then I have a video exclusive to channel members that talks about just that. You could become a member today and experience other members' videos as well, more of which are in the pipeline. I also have a PatNat Games Discord server if you care to file a complaint more directly about my awful opinions. Maybe you love Donkey Kong 64. Well, you can tell me in the comments below, or join my Discord and tell me to my face. And of course, you can always subscribe to check out more videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. So long.